God it's Friday and thank God for life. Good morning and welcome to the Dailies here on Echo Television, where we take newspaper reviews and the current stories and happening in Nigeria. I am Rachel Tanze, your host this morning. Don't forget that we are live on Facebook and YouTube. Follow us and drop your comments on what story is interesting you this morning and this hour. And I'll be starting with the first paper, which is the Punch newspaper. And at the top of the paper, Nigeria's poverty exceeds World Bank projection. 5 states lead. And there is a writer that follows the story. 133 million Nigerians ranked poor in federal government interest poverty index. Economists slam government demand effective policies, and you can read that on page 19. Naira depreciation, inflation erode workers, 25 trillion naira salaries, and you can read that on page 4. How delays costly court processes frustrate family access to deceased saving, and you can read that story too on page 16 and 17. The big story on the Punch newspaper on hoodlums attack. Federal government deploys soldiers, DSS in INEC offices nationwide. The writer following that story, security team to be drawn from Army, Police, DSS, NSCDC, and Fire Service. Governors using talks, state security outfits to cause violence. This is coming from the IG, and he is crying out to the government. U.S. threatens to sanction candidates and politicians sponsoring violent campaigns. Obi supporters protest alleged underage registration vote buying plot, and you can see that on the story on page 14, and there is a picture story regarding that. Still on the Punch newspaper, 11 billion naira addition to defense budget uncovered, minister queried, and you can read that on page 14. I was forced to sign prepared police statement, says Chidima. This is concerning the Ataga case. Still on looted funds, EFCC puts more governors under watch, and you can find that story on page 16. And that's all the news on the Punch newspaper. I will be moving to the next paper, which is This Day. Jim Ovia, IT practitioner to headline Zenith Tech Fair, and you can read that on page 5. More trouble for P&ID as firm owned by Danjuma Drax ex-partner to court over $40 million loss, and you can read that on page 5. Southeast businessmen support Tinubu's presidential bid with 1 billion naira. UTM Offshore, JGC, Technip Energies sign agreements on Nigerians FLNG, and you can read what that agreement is all about on page 5. Still on our Naira redesign, is significant step to economic recovery. This is coming from Bawa. Says more governors being monitored for stashed cash. ICPC recovers 117 billion naira in 8 months. Arraign former customary court of appeal judge. CBN direct banks to work on Saturdays to beat deadline for return of old banknotes, and you can find this story on page 5. And I'll say I am impressed that says more governors being monitored for stashed cash, and we can see that there is a recovery of 117 billion naira. And yesterday the news, this was also mentioned that we need to see some update and some report on what is the progress. Is this really helping the government fight corruption? Is this really helping with money circulating in the bank as it is expected? And in the long run, if what this process and policy was designed for, if it will give us the result that we are expecting as Nigeria, then let them keep the good work. But then if it is not, then what is the next step to be taken? So I believe that this is a good update that every Nigerian need to hear, that of course what the CBN is doing and the finance ministry is doing is really helping with corruption and then helping money circulate the right ways in our banks. Still on This Day newspaper, signing the FNLG agreement, for Nigeria, and there is a picture story with that. And that's all the news on this day newspaper. I will be moving to the next paper, which is the Friday Leadership. And the big story there, breach of Electoral Act. Party officials risk 6 months jail over vague financial report. The writer says CSOs worried over non-compliance. INEC's inability to prosecute offenders. Electoral body yet to publish audited accounts of parties since 2017 as required by law. And you can read all of that on page 4 of Friday Leadership. 3 of every 5 Nigerian is poor. This is a report from the MBS, and you should want to read that, and you can find that story on page 7. NYSC DG father removed from office after 6 months. And if you want to know what he did, you can find that story on page 17. Tinubu assures Southeast of massive development and inclusion. That can be found on page 7. Obi gets Wike support for campaign logistics. You can read that on page 11. Ovia Oyegu orders to speak at Zenith Tech Fair 2.0, and you can read that on page 20. And that's all the news on Friday Leadership. And the next paper I'll be taking is the Daily Independent. Wike promises logistics support for Peter Obi's campaign. Buhari warns ASU of the trade union against strike, and you can read that story on page 4. And I would like to say that the government shouldn't warn these unions, but rather should come to their need. They are fighting for a cause. They are on this strike for a reason. They are telling you, the government, that you need to hear them, that they have a problem, that their schools are having problems, that the education sector is not doing well, that the labor sector is struggling. People are moving without pay. Workers are going without salary. Inflation is going high. You're not paying us, and the cost of food is going high. How do you want us to survive? So I believe that these strikes, protests, and campaign against no pay, no work, no pay policy is for a reason. There is a reason behind it. And I believe that what these new unions only need from you as the government is to hear them and come to their aid, solve their problem. You are the government, and you are the only one that can do what they are asking of you to do. Instead of a threat or instead of a warning, why don't you come to their need? Why don't you listen to this union and then do as they're asking you? Try your best as a government. Let's see that, and then we can say, okay, when they come out tomorrow, they are just unserious, or they have no reason to do that. But these people are fighting a cause. So instead of a warning coming from the government, I believe that results and problems should be solved for this union. Still on the Daily Independent, the big story is on Naira redesign. EFCC puts more governors on watch list over stashed funds. Troops eliminate over 50 terrorists in Northeast and Northwest, and you can read that on page 6. PTAD clears over 610 billion naira pension arrears in 6 years, recovers 26.5 million pounds colonial fund from UK, and lists 303 ex-Biafran policemen on parole. You can read that on page 30. Atiku berates federal government over report that 133 million Nigerians are poor. Says such development threat to security and stability of Nigeria. And you can read that on page 7. And the truth is, if almost half of your population are poor, it is a threat to security. We can see that when these kidnappers kidnap people, they are always asking for a ransom. And over the years, throughout this year, we see that kidnapping has become a business, because these kidnappers are making millions just by the ransom they receive from families and from government. So yes, when your population is poor, it is a threat to security. It means we will have more insecurity, because petty theft will now turn to armed robbery, and people will become violent because nothing is working. Everybody will not be safe, because the hungry man will do whatever it takes and whatever it it will cost to feed his family and put food on the table. And we know what that means, that it will not be good for the country. So something should be done about this poverty report. Is not a good thing, and then something should be done about it. We're looking forward that years to come, Nigeria won't have 133 million people in poverty, because this is not a good report. It doesn't say well of us. Still on the Daily Independent, Silva hails UTM offshore partners on deal for Nigeria's first FLNG facility, and you can read that on page 6. IGP meets party leaders over threats to 2023 polls. Catholic Church tax federal government on violence-free election, and that can be found on page 6. INEC vows to punish officials who registered underage voters, and we hope that the INEC punishes and not just talk about punishing people for such offense. And you can read that on page 20. Legislative support key in addressing insecurity. This is coming from the NSA, and you can read that on page 6. And that's all the news on Daily Independent. And the next paper I'll be taking is the Daily Sun newspaper. Tinubu unfolds economic plan for Southeast, pledges industrial boom in zone to open ports outside Lagos. He is the man Nigeria needs. This is coming from Kalu. INEC to prosecute core members, others involved in election fraud. And the big story on Daily Sun, still on looted funds. We've placed many governors on watch list. This is coming from EFCC chair. Advises politicians to focus on issues, avoid using illicit funds for campaign. Chinese President Jinping with Director General World Trade Organization Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala at the Bali, Indonesia G20 summit, and there is a picture story showing the two of them together. Still on the Daily Sun newspaper, Naira redesign, we need more time to evacuate money from forest, Miyetti Allah begs CBN. You can read that story on page 3. Troop destroy 44 illegal refineries, arrest 29 oil thieves, rescue 41 abductees. That can be found on page 4. PDP holds Umbrella Day in Lagos for Atiku and Okowa. Buhari, Sultan Oyegun tax ASU, other trade unions on negotiations and strike. Expose underage dead persons, foreigners in voters registration. INEC begs Nigerians. Wike promises Obi logistics support during Labour Party campaign in Rivers, and that can be found on page 8. And at the downside of the paper, Gates Foundation targets health, agri, gender equality in Nigeria, Kenya, and others, and you can read that on page 8. And that's all the news on the Daily Sun. And I'll be moving to the next paper, which is the Nigerian Tribune. Governors behind political violence. This is coming from the Inspector General of the Police. 133 million Nigerians multidimensionally poor. Atiku blames APC for enthroning legacy of poverty. This is though coming from the MBS, and you can read that on page 3. And the big story on Nigerian Tribune, which is the big story on most of our papers, still on Naira redesign. Number of governors under watch rising. This is coming from EFCC, and we hope that they are not just being under watched, but if they are found wanting, that they'll be called to book. You can read that on page 8. Police arraign auxiliary over destruction of APC billboards in Oyo, and you can read that story on page 26. 2 suspected invaders of justice, Dailies home escape from Kuje prison, and that's coming from the police. Using cannabis to cook, dangerous, condemnable. This is coming from the NDLEA buzz, and it is a sad thing and very strange that people will go through the extra mile to consume hard drug. Why would you cook with cannabis? Why would you cook with weed? These are not healthy on a normal day. Even when you smoke them, talk more of putting them in your food. And we know that when food digests in our body, it is meant to neutralize us, like we're supposed to get nutrition from the food we eat. But instead, we decide to poison ourselves in the name of high or just doing what others are doing. Please, let's take our health seriously and don't cook with cannabis. We can see that it is very dangerous. I don't think we need to be told it's dangerous. We know what drugs does to the body. So eating it also does the same thing. So please, don't harm yourself. Be a person that is mindful about what you consume, your health. Deliberately want to live long, deliberately want to be healthy, deliberately stay away from drug. If you want to become something in life and if you want to have a meaningful life, stay away from anything that will endanger you, because in the end, you're not the only one putting yourself at risk, but even others around you. Still on Nigerian Tribune, we are happy G5 governor still with us. PDP presidential campaign cancelled, and you can read that on page 5. U.S. issues fresh visa sanction threat on instigators of violence. We are committed to tidying voters register. This is coming from INEC, and you can read that on page 4. Says all BVAs needed for 2023 poll ready before December. Distribute PVCs in your custody. Utomi Yusuf orders tell INEC. Storm Commission Secretariat demand decentralization of collection. And that's all the news on the Nigerian Tribune. And I'll be moving to the next paper, which is the Daily Times. Starting with the big story, Buhari ready to hand over to whoever wins 2023 election. This is coming from NSA. Says achieving immediate goal of defeating insecurity requires support of the National Assembly. And at the top side of the paper, some governors are promoting political violence. This is coming from the IGP. This is still on 2023 election. Vows to arrest, prosecute persons found to have perpetuated electoral violence. And you can find that on page 6. Still on the Daily Times newspaper, Naira redesign very significant to anti-corruption war. This is coming from Bawa. Over half of Nigerians are multidimensionally poor. This is coming from the MBS. Says 86 million in North, 47 million in South, as 133 million Nigerians are poor. INEC vows to address issue with voters register, punish culpable officers, and you can read that on page 3. Wike promises to support Peter Obi's campaign in Rivers, and you can find that story on page 4. This is still on the 2023 election, in as much as it's a strange one, because we know that Wike is in PDP and Peter Obi is for Labour Party. But whatever the alignment is, we do not know. But then he plans on supporting him with logistics during his campaign. We will watch and see how 2023 election turns out to be, because a lot is going on. And that's all the news on the Daily Times newspaper. And the next paper I'll be taking is the Nation newspaper. IG blames violence tension on governors. Tinubu to make Southeast industrial hub. Don't toy with Uzodinma. Zenith Tech Fair 2.0 attracts global brand leaders. Why we dropped 20 billion naira case against governor by Kanu's lawyer. You can find that on page 5. First Lady, governor's wives rally for Tinubu Shetima in Ilorin, and you can read that on page 3. And there is a picture story with that news. And the big story on the Nation newspaper, Wike attacks Atiku from criticizing Buhari. This is coming from the security chiefs. And the writer says, Rivers governor vows to remain in PDP, fights vultures, scavengers. Obi outlines plan. And Obiodun takes 472.25 billion naira budget for 2023 to Ogun Assembly, and you can read that on page 5. And there we have a picture story supporting that news. Nigeria faces debt servicing challenges, DMO warns, and you can continue with that on page 4. Oyo ex Nutri Leader Auxiliary arraigned for vandalism, and you can read that on page 2. And that's all the news on the Nation newspaper, and I'll be taking the Business Day newspaper next. Crypto obsessed Nigerians real as foreign FTX collapses. And the big story on Business Day, weak Naira spices up local condiments market. Still on the Business Day newspaper, Nigeria eyes 5G deployment via new satellite that can be found on page 30. Zenith Tech Fair to showcase innovation in AI and others. AML emerges as largest fund managers, and you can turn to page 31 to read more of that on the Business Day newspaper. And that's all the news on Business Day paper. And the next paper I'll be taking is the New Telegraph. Federal government revenue decline threatens Nigeria. 42.84 trillion naira debt sustainability. You can read that from on page 27. And there's a writer that says VAT should move to 17.5%, says DMO. And as a Nigerian, I would like to say that is very high. Our value added tax, if it should be added to 17.5%, that would be high. Nigerians will be paying a lot on tax, even more than the goods we consume. So I don't know what's the reason behind such a very high value added tax. If we are having a decline in our revenue, I think we should think of the way to improve our revenue. We should think of what to do to make money in Nigeria. We keep talking about leaving the oil sector, not neglecting the oil sector, but leaving it and then focusing on other places. We have agriculture, we have minerals, we have many other things that can make us lots of money as a country. We can export finished goods to other countries that we are bigger than. I believe there's a lot we can do, but I don't think adding a value added tax to 17.5% is the best way, because it means we might end up paying more on tax than even the goods we consume. I hope something is done about that, but I believe this is a suggestion and is not yet implemented. So I hope that 17.5% will not be implemented as our value added tax. Osibajo, Atiku, Tinubu, and others for New Telegraph's 2022 award ceremony, and that can be found on page 28. Buhari, Sultan, Oyegun to ASU. Stop using strike as weapon against government, and that can be found on page 26. MBS put number of poor Nigerians at 133 million. The big story on New Telegraph, conduct of some governors instigating political violence, and you can read that story on page 26. Says 52 politically motivated violent incidents recorded since September threatens to bring talks sponsors to justice. More governors under surveillance. This is coming from the EFCC boss. Ineligible registrant, we will probe infraction and punish perpetrators. This is coming from INEC. And there is the pictures showing all the New Telegraph awards and who are to receive them this year, 2022. And that's all the news on the Daily and on the New Telegraph. And I'll be moving to the next paper, which is the Guardian newspaper. Nairobi design, more governors under scrutiny, says EFCC. Mark ban actions over fund stock in forest. That can be found on page 3. Relief at Lagos airport restores runway lights 14 years after. And I want to say, I wonder why it took so long. I keep saying it's not all about building things. Maintenance is equally important. It's not about building roads. Maintenance is equally important. It's not about creating industries, not about infrastructures. What about the maintenance that are supposed to go into making sure that this thing lasts us long? And we can see that 14 years after, Lagos have put new lights for their runway. This is very dangerous, I would like to say, but for whatsoever reason it took long, we are glad that there are lights now on the runway. Still on the Guardian newspaper, UTM Offshore JGC, others sign agreements for Nigeria's first FLNG facility. NPA denies collecting jetty charges in dollars, and you can read that on page 7. And the big story on the Guardian newspaper, which is on most of our paper, is 133 million Nigerians remain poor despite sharing $700 million Abacha loot. The writer following that story, 25.3 million Nigerians face acute nutrition insecurity in 2023. This one is coming from UNICEF, saying over 40 million children in Nigeria face acute malnutrition. PDP carpets APC over MB story on the front page of the Guardian newspaper, and continue on page 6 of the paper. And we have a picture story on the road to Qatar 2022 World Cup without Nigeria. And Nigeria lost to Portugal yesterday 4-0. You can read that on page 4 and 5. And the last story at the downside of the paper, US backs INEC on BVAs, threatens visa ban on election riggers, and that can be found on page 6. And I'll be moving to the next paper, which is Nigeria News Direct. Digital innovation on showcase as Zenith Bank holds Tech Fair 2.0. UPDC examines housing development imperatives in Nigeria on 25th anniversary. The big story on Nigerian News Direct, money laundering, sponsoring of violence. EFCC Inspector General of Police stage surveillance on governors. The writers following that, more governors on watch list, as IGP says police in custody of report of governors sponsoring violence. ICPC recovers 117 billion naira in 8 months from anti-graft war, and you can read that on page 3. Still on Nigerian News Direct, Tinubu is the best for Nigeria. This is coming from the Kwara governor. Display of voters register. INEC vows to fish out ineligible registrants. You can find that on page 6. And we have Femi Adesina's corner on the column on the back page of Nigerian News Direct. And if you want to know what the minister has to say, get the Nigerian News Direct for yourself. And that's all the news on Nigerian News Direct. And at this time, we'll be taking a short break. I will be taking a short break. Don't go anywhere. Stay with me. Thank you for staying with me. Don't forget that we are live on YouTube and on Facebook. Please drop your comment as a report from the MBS that 133 million Nigerians are poor. What do you have to say about that? Drop your comments on Facebook and on YouTube, and let's know and tell the government what do they have to do to curb poverty in Nigeria, as I don't think it is a good thing where more than half of the population of this country are living in poverty. And the next paper I'll be taking is Nature News. And the first story there, African Development Bank invests $20 million in private equity fund targeting renewable energy projects in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can continue with that story on page 3. And the big story there is 900 million Africans rely on solid biomass. This is a report. 600,000 die annually from indoor pollution. And we would like to say this is true. There is a picture story there where we can see a woman cooking with firewood, and it is common everywhere. We cook our meals on this firewood, we use coal and all of that, and we can see that it is dangerous for our body. We can see that 600,000 people die annually from indoor pollution in Africa. Another downside of the paper, 20 teams line up for legacy volleyball championship in Lagos, and you can read that on page 21. And that's all the news on Nature News, and I'll be moving to the next paper, which is the Blueprint newspaper. APC unfolds agenda for Southeast. Obi's kinsmen boost Tinubu campaign with 1 billion naira. The writer says, I will create new industrial hubs in Southeast. This is coming from Asiwaju, the APC presidential candidate. I will give Labour Party candidate logistics support. This is coming from Wike. You can read that story on page 5 and continue on page 6 also. And the big story on Blueprint newspaper, the Inspector General Police alarm on 2023 election, saying governors sponsoring talks, local security outfit. 52 campaign violent cases recorded in 22 states. Tax INEC on regulatory enforcement sanction, and you can read that on page 6. More governors on the watch concerning the Naira redesign, and then returning stash out funds that are not in the bank. And this is coming from EFCC. Troops killed 32 terrorists, seized over 16 million from collaborators. And I would like to say these are the kind of good news we would want to be seeing on our newspaper, that our troops are working and are fighting terrorism day and night, and that truly one day we can wake up to a security, to a Nigeria that is secured and safe and free of terrorism. 133 million Nigerians living in poverty. This is coming from the MBS. Still on voter register, we will probe reported infractions, discipline officials. This is coming from INEC. Federal government, no work, no pay attempt to criminalize strike. This is coming from ERC concerning the ASU strike. PTAD pays 610 billion naira pension in 6 years. NAHCON to start preparation with conference December 21. This is on Hajj for 2023. 70% Nigerian youth not achieving full potentials. And if you want to know more of that, you can read that on page 13. Eminent IT global practitioner to grace Zenith Tech Fair 2.0, and you can read that on page 24. And that's all the news on Blueprint newspaper. And the next paper I'll be taking is the Vanguard newspaper, and we have Olufasan saying 200,000 special assistants, Wike impunity demeans governance, and you can read that on page 16. 9 family members killed, 7 injured in fresh Plateau attack, and you can read that on page 6. For secular government, Tinubu assures Khan, and we can see that since yesterday on the papers, and you can read more of that on page 26. States and local governments want shares in NNPC, and you can read that on page 8. And the big story on the Vanguard newspaper, bill for restructuring, resource control ready. This is coming from Atiku, and the writer says power devolution and state police on the cards. I will form a government of national unity. PDP will win Lagos, 24 other states in 2023, says IU. Guardian tortures 11-year-old maid to death in jail. This is a sad one, and you can read that on page 6. And I would like to say, for parents who give their words out to stay with the guardian, to school them, or for whatever reason, please be sure. Make sure that there is someone protecting your word regardless of where they are going. Let's not use poverty or our inability to be able to take care of our children as the reason why these children fall into the wrong hands and face domestic violence. And this is not the first time we are having such on the newspaper, and we have witnessed some of this in our community. Don't just give your child to anybody. Make sure that the church is aware of where your child is. Make sure that the community is aware of that. Make sure that there are NGOs that protect children's right on things like that. Let them know that your child is at a certain place because it's understood. Some are from the villages and they want their children to be schooled. They want a brighter future for their children, and they bring them to the city to stay with families in return that their child will be schooled. But most of the time they end up with violently abused children and even sometimes death in cases like this. So please, parents, look out for your children. Take all the necessary steps when you are taking them to live with another family. Still on the Vanguard newspaper, Senate in rowdy session over Naira redesign, and you can find that on page 7. Igbo elders tackle Soludo over comments on Peter Obi, and you can read that on page 11. ASU members receive their rightful salary in October. Wike apologizes to Osumole over attacks and comment. And then Zik posthumous birthday, Nigeria's unity, non-negotiable, Eve Ohaneze, Sultan Zulum, and others. This is coming from 7. You can read that on page 7. And there's a picture story with Glow Festival of Joy promotion. And that's all the news on the Vanguard newspaper. And the next paper I'll be taking is the Business Standard. It is an international use for Bangladesh. Coke's Bazaar, drugs, guns, mothers, and the untouchables. You can read that on page 3. Expedite petroleum refinery here. Prime Minister Hasina urges Kuwait. TK 5,000 CR refund scheme formed for farmers to boost food production. Price of soybean oil up by 12 and sugar by 13. Call money rate highest in 4 months at 5.83%. And that's all the news on the Business Standard. And the next paper I'll be taking is the Sporting Sun for our sport lovers. Osimhen wins Emerging Player of the Year plaque, and you can read that on page 6. Fernandez caused brace in Super Eagles humiliation. Bayern join race to sign Son, and Messi lodges in student hostel at Qatar break. Old ladies frown at Di Maria publicized Fendi splashes 333,700 on Lamborghini. And there's a story that says Victor Moses, I now react to retirement of Cahill. That can be found on page 6. Man City denies Ronaldo link. And then we have Adesanya released after arrest. ATP final, Djokovic cruises into semi-finals. And that's all the news on Sporting News. And the next paper I'll be taking is the Punch in the Sponge Sport Extra. Ronaldo eager to start 5th Mondial, and you can find that on page 2. And then we have Portugal 4, Nigeria 0. Eagles friendly woes continue. Team lacked cohesion against Selecap and then Exeter. And I happened to watch this match, and I like to say yes, Portugal beat us, and Nigeria wasn't at their top form though. And I would like to say it was a little bit predictable that they would score, and I was not surprised, but I thought we would at least score 1 goal, but we didn't. We missed a penalty kick and we lost the chance of at least having 1 goal. Still on the Punch Sport newspaper, Bankole Olowokere exclusive. What affected the team was that the last player that lost her penalty often converted all her kicks during training. Their hope was dashed by the one who happened to be their best penalty taker, and sometimes this happened in football. Still on the Punch Sport Extra, my under-17 Women's World Cup dream. The pay open to Chelsea move. Red's Eye Mount, you can read that on page 4. Kante to leave Chelsea for free, and Liverpool set to seal Bellingham deal. And we have Okocha tops list of most dribbled in World Cup game. And at the downside of the paper, United players want Ronaldo out. That can be found on page 5. City willing to pay Cruz 230,000 pounds a week, and you can find that on page 5. And that's all the news on Sponge Sports Extra. And this is where I'll be stopping today. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for watching the news and reading the review with me. And I hope you've dropped your comments on Facebook and on YouTube, and keep following us. Have a great weekend. Have a great time. Bye-bye.